My name is Dennis Speed. I would like to welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, May 20th. Much is going on in the world, and our organization is involved in doing much. What we need to do at this point is to upgrade the process of organizing dialogue and adoption of our economic policies and our policy of what we're referring to as the global health platform. So what I want to do is to, first of all, remind people who may have already been organizing with this and tell people who have not yet that there's a statement called Global Health Security Requires Medical Infrastructure in Every Country. Major industrial nations must collaborate now. And this statement was specifically directed at tomorrow's Global Health Summit, which is happening in Rome. But the statement is, while it's directed at that, it offers an approach still not adopted, not officially anyway, and is an approach that we would believe that, for example, that the United Nations Security Council could take up. I'll just refer to the first part of that statement, in which we say this: the only way that the prolonged COVID-19 pandemic can be stopped is by rethinking the solution. We must have modern healthcare systems in every country. This means infrastructure for public health and for medical care delivery at modern standards to all populations. One model for this is the U.S. Hill-Burton Act, otherwise known as the Hospital Survey and Construction Act of 1946, whose principle was to state how many hospital beds per 1,000 residents must be in each locality. At that time, the estimate was 4.5. Look at instances of our ability to do this today. The 1,000-bed Shuoshenshan Hospital was built in 12 days in Wuhan, China in 2020. In the United States, multiple field hospitals were built in record time last spring by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We must do this simultaneously around the world. So there's much more there, but the conception is that this is a statement we're circulating. We want everybody to pick up on, and particularly what we're trying to do is to have people join our Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. And this means people from the clergy, people from the military, retired military personnel, farm leaders, and people from medical establishments, also former heads or present heads of universities, and there may be others. Doesn't mean that everybody has to be prominent. There's many ways in which to do this. And we have something called a Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites. We will describe the work of that committee later when we get ready to get to the Q&A section. I want to point out something else that was said by Vladimir Putin yesterday when he was welcoming new ambassadors from 23 countries. He talked about the various crises facing the world: coronavirus, terrorism, the risks of drug trafficking and organized crime, decades-old regional conflicts like Afghanistan and Libya, which, by the way, is very related to the drug traffic and organized crime. And now what is happening in what people keep calling the Middle East, but is more properly really called Southwest Asia. And he said, the epidemic has proven a real test for such universal human values as solidarity, mutual assistance, and love for humanity. I repeat once again, it is possible to ensure peace, stability, and sustainable global development only through the efforts of the entire international community. He had much more to say about that in terms of this being the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis invaded June 22nd, so that anniversary is still in front of us, invaded Russia, and that war between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Germany would ultimately result in 27 million dead on the Russian side. So So he is talking about the notion that you have to have the well-being and prosperity of all human beings, as Vladimir Putin said. But you can only do that if you were to establish such a global health platform as the one that we're describing. Nobody else is talking about that. I mean, the Chinese, the Russians, nobody is talking about that in the terms in which we have proposed it. We can say something about that, but specifically we are stating that you have to take the most advanced technologies of construction, of excavation, and of power generation, and you've got to make this available worldwide. And you can't be talking about price tags or bills. You've got to talk about the survival of the human race in the same way it happens during war, where purportedly for the purpose of the survival of states, everything gets sacrificed. Well, in this case, it's the actual purported survival of the whole human race, and therefore there's no price tag too high, and it's not a matter of money anyway. It's a matter of actually getting the human capital deployed for the purpose of saving humanity as a whole. So I have some other things to say concerning the so-called Middle Eastern situation, but I think what I want to do now is go directly to Diane, and we will have a chance to discuss much about this as we get into the Q&A. And I'll just say the following about how I'm going to discuss it when I discuss it. I want to discuss it from the standpoint of why different people that have accurate on-the-ground perceptions from Israel, let's say, or that area, and I have a report from one Palestinian and two Israelis, that the things they accurately report still paint an untruthful picture. That is, it looks true from where they are standing, but it's actually fundamentally untrue. And the reason that happens is because if you look at any situation as a local situation in itself, what you will establish as, if you will, the coordinates of truth, the apparent geometry of truth, the environment in which you are operating, it will always be false. You'll never come to the proper conclusion, and you won't be able to tell what you're doing wrong, because from the standpoint from which you are attempting to analyze things, it will all appear to be logical conclusions deduced from your experience. And that's precisely what lies every time. The issue of what we're talking about around the World Health Platform is intended to cause a circumstance where people will suddenly run into paradoxes which shouldn't exist and which cause them to change the axioms by which they believe they have to figure out what reality is. And this is the only possible way that the human race will survive in the short term. Unless people can master the art of confronting their own axioms by digging them out when they're invisible, then it's impossible for people to get out of their own way. And right now, what we have to do is cause the human race to get out of its own way. We're not talking about global warming or climate change. Matter of fact, that's opposed to the human race. But we are talking about coming by a whole different way of approaching what it means to be human on this planet and to collaborate together. So we're going to go to Diane, and then we'll go to discussion. And in the context of that discussion, we'll further discuss some of the work of the committee, inclusive of a couple of reports I think we're going to receive. So, Diane?
Yes. I presume I can be heard.
Yes,
all right?
You're pretty clear. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you read Putin's comments, because I think that's really the point of the matter. And I have something also from Lyndon LaRouche from June of 2001. People may remember that it was the 2000 election where we went on for weeks not knowing whether Gore or Bush had won. And there were all kinds of questions. And LaRouche had warned that in January of that year, when Bush was talking about nominating Ashcroft as Attorney General of a Reichstag fire event. And then later in August of 2001, LaRouche warned explicitly of a terrorist attack on Washington, D.C. in that case. And just weeks later, 9/11 occurred. But in this June paper, it's called Faith, Hope, and Agape, and he speaks of the general welfare principle. During the 15th century European Renaissance, that principle of the general welfare, which is also known in the Christian tradition by the name of the common good, was belatedly established not only as a principle of sovereign national government, it also provides the basis for what John Quincy Adams, then U.S. Secretary of State, named a community of principle among such sovereign states, very much like what Putin was just saying. Thus, during the Renaissance, for the first time in all known human existence, came the establishment of the efficient form of a new principle of government, the principle known variously as the common good or general welfare. The establishment of this principle of the state as proposed by Nicholas of Cusa's Concordantia Catholica, as typified by both the martyrdom of Joan of Arc and the reforms enacted by France's Louis XI and England's Henry VII, implicitly denied the right of any national or international oligarchy to hold the majority of the population as a whole in the condition of virtual human cattle. So he's making the point that this breakthrough of Cusa, what Joan of Arc was fighting for, this conception of the general welfare of human beings, that the purpose of government was not so that some rich overlord or whatever could, treat you like cattle, but was for the good, the common good of the population. And of course, you would say if a government doesn't make your life better, if your conditions are not improved as a result of having a government, then why have it? Maybe you should do something else. Now, that being said, on this question of health, it is very interesting to look at actually the development of basic fundamental infrastructure in the United States and how that intersects this question of the general welfare and of health care, because what we are speaking about uniquely, and tomorrow is the Global Health Summit in Rome, organized by the European Union. I'm sorry to say that Ursula von der Leyen, what is she now, the head of the European Parliament, or what is her position? I can't remember. She was defense or something, but what is she now? She's one of the people presiding over this, and she's a fanatical green lunatic fascist. So they have other people there who presumably want to do something about health care, but they're going to take it in the terms in which it was perverted in the United States. And we have to change that. And our work on opposing the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, are really crucial interventions on this. And you may not have seen it that way, but it's become very much clearer to me in the last days. So in 1798, President John Adams signs into existence the U.S. Public Health Service. What is this? At that time, it was a service to protect the health of our seamen and immigrants coming over by sea. But you can imagine conditions on ships and so on was rather squalid, and they wanted to keep people in good health, so they were looking at these questions. Now, fast forward to 1914, in 1914, the U.S. Public Health Service actually created the first national standard for drinking water. So imagine that. Prior to that, we didn't have standards of what should be in water, what should not, how clean, purity, this, that, what percentage this element or that. But in 1914, this was created, and shortly thereafter, they decided to address the spread of malaria in the United States, and they got rid of standing pools of water, old, dirty water. They created drainage systems or drained swamps and things like that. And this caused such a dramatic decrease in the number of mosquitoes and malaria outbreak that this period in which the Public Health Service did this to get rid of this dirty old water sitting around was the greatest single decrease in morbidity and mortality in American history. Now, there was more, and there's a delightful story by some of these engineers. And see, here's something an environmental engineer was not someone who took care of their favorite tree or Mother Nature, but they improved the environment for the purpose of protecting human health. And the first major shift in this occurred, appropriately enough, in something called the Great Stink of 1858. And the Great Stink occurred, this is the appropriate part, in London. London, which supposedly was the largest city in the world at the time. Maybe that's true because some of the Chinese cities had been destroyed by then. But at any rate, they had large amounts of sewage. It was a heat wave, and you just created what was described by an engineer as the perfect storm of rubbish, stench, and death. So you had all kinds of diseases with this, baking human sewage in the streets and so on, absolutely horrific conditions, and it was called the Great Stink of 1858. So what happened is a committee was formed to address the problem. It was led by a civil engineer who was the chief engineer of London's Metropolitan Board of Works. And what he did is created 6 major intercepting sewers and a pumping station to carry London's wastewater to a discharge point that was well downstream. Okay, so think about it. This was their initiative on public health, was to clean the city to get decent sanitation. And what engineers say, and I found this very, very interesting because really up until the 1960s, the U.S. Public Health Service was engineers, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which was created in Georgia and founded in Georgia because you had similar conditions of heat and dirty water and sanitation. So until 1970, the head of the CDC was actually an engineer, not a medical doctor. And engineers, environmental engineers, not only studied engineering, they studied biology, they studied chemistry, and they studied disease transmission. They studied epidemiology, so that the environmental engineers knew the relationship between dirty water and public health and transmission of disease. So our cities were built, buildings were designed. People know the impact from housing, I know, in the row houses, in the townhouses in Washington, D.C. that were built in the 1890s, for example, something similar, New York City with tuberculosis. So people knew, okay, every room has to have a window. And in these old houses, the doors actually have windows above them, so you can get ventilation, you can get air flowing through the whole house. So it's aesthetically pleasing. It's also healthy. Now, what happened is I guess it was 1964, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, came out. And, it's terrible, DDT, we're getting rid of malaria. The whole thing was a fraud. But in 1970, you had the first Earth Day. In 1970, suddenly the head of the CDC was no longer an engineer but a medical doctor. And I'm not saying this to say that we shouldn't have medical doctors or consult with medical doctors when you're dealing with disease, but think about what the intent of this is, as opposed to the general welfare or the public good, or what you're actually looking to address with these questions. So now, having said that, let's look again at the quote that people have heard, I think last week. Tim Rush may have said it on this call or the Monday call, from Parson Thomas Malthus, his essay on the principle of population from 1798. Isn't that interesting? The very year that the U.S. Public Health Service is created, Parson Malthus is writing, quote, "All children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread this too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders," unquote. So now I think this even becomes very, very much more clear, because it's a direct assault on the principle of the general welfare and the knowledge that was just being developed at that time about the questions of overcrowding. I don't know if people knew bacteria, but they knew there were dirt. There were things that you had to keep clean, that having circulation of air and so on was a healthy thing. And he's proposing the opposite. Now, what is the green movement saying today? Well, I referenced already Rachel Carson, and if people saw Dr. Clem from South Africa, the nuclear scientist, a few weeks ago on the Saturday meeting, where he talked about DDT, and he said a rumor had gotten out because DDT was so effective at killing the mosquitoes that were spreading malaria, but somehow through the gossip line it got construed that eating DDT could keep you from getting malaria, and you had mothers actually feeding their children DDT, and no one was dying. It wasn't hurting them, right? So this very effective, beneficial pesticide was banned, and you had skyrocket. Malaria came back as the major disease, and the kind of pesticides they came up with to replace it were much more toxic to everything and much less effective. Well, now, wouldn't you know it, a new report has discovered that pollution from farms has caused 17,900 deaths per year. That growing food is bad for the environment, and it's having a negative impact on human health because of the smell of hog poop and cows farting. So farms are going to have to be abolished. 17,900 people have died from farms, and never mind about all of us who depend on farms to eat. That's really not important, because actually, as we all know from the environmentalist movement, the biggest threat to the planet is human life anyway. And the worst thing you could possibly do is to bring a child into this world to further destroy the planet. And then you have the Lancet, the British medical journal, which is owned by a Dutch company, which says surgical, obstetric, and anesthesia care is one of the major contributors to climate change within the health sector. Okay, so just like Barack Obama told the people of South Africa that they should not have automobiles and air conditioning, because if they insisted on having the same standard of living that people in the United States or Western Europe did, that the planet would boil over, the Lancet says that we simply should not make life-saving procedures available to 5 billion people, because this is going to destroy the planet. So somehow the conception that we had initially of the general welfare, the U.S. Public Health Service, and even the CDC, of actually creating an environmental engineers whose purpose was to carry out engineering tasks to make the environment conducive to human life, now this has all been perverted, and what we want to do is actually increase the death rate in the name supposedly of saving the planet. But when you look at the effects of the things they are proposing, or saving Mother Nature and the planet, what you see is that everything they're proposing is actually also far more destructive, like windmills and solar panels, which are full of noxious chemicals. They're not biodegradable. They have gigantic places where they're burying these things, etc. They're not cleaner. They don't produce less CO2, because you have to have an equal amount of gas to make up for that energy, unless you just decide to not have energy. So the whole thing is a fraud, but it's not only a fraud, it's actually evil, because it explicitly violates the principle of it's an attack on the principle of the general welfare. It's an attack on human life per se. So when you think about what Helga and Dr. Elders proposed with the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, this is actually, unfortunately, in our current culture, a revolutionary idea, where you're saying that once again we are going to be committed to the principle of the general welfare and to having a platform designed by engineers who know things about water management and power management and so on, that is going to lift the entire human population into a place where you can eliminate pandemic disease. And you would never have something as absurd as what happened with lead in the drinking water, not only in Flint, Michigan. This is the case all over the country. But there has been really a separation, and I would say not only between medical science and engineering, but we are taking science out of medicine. We're taking intelligibility out of the process of production. And therefore, it turns out to be the case that if you don't like the Great Reset, if you don't like the Green New Deal, the actual perfect way of stopping it is to develop a health platform in every country, just as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed. So that's what I had to say, and I'll just stop there.
Okay, very good. We'll open up the queue. There are several things to discuss.